All right, let's go. Number 10. The Dancing Plague of Strasbourg. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was unremarkable. The markets opened at dawn. The tanners worked the river. Grain stores were low but not yet desperate. On a narrow street whose name the records do not preserve, a woman known as Frau Trophäa walked outside and began to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. She moved alone in the July heat, and she did not stop. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Within a month, the number reached approximately 400. The city council, unable to explain what was happening, made a decision that still confounds historians. They built a stage. They hired musicians. They ordered more dancing. No one who watched the beginning understood what they were seeing. The movements were not joyful. Faces twisted with exhaustion. Eyes lost focus and did not return. Some of the dancers wept as they moved. Others screamed without pausing their rhythm. Their feet bled through their shoes and they did not stop. Neighbors brought water and bread. The dancers could not hold the cups. The motion would not release their hands. Relatives tried physically restraining the afflicted, grabbing arms, blocking paths. The dancers fought free with a strength that startled everyone who touched them, then resumed immediately. It was not defiance. It was something closer to drowning on dry land. The body was obeying an instruction the mind could not hear. The city's physicians diagnosed hot blood and prescribed more dancing. A guild hall was opened as a dedicated venue. Musicians were hired from public funds. The afflicted were gathered from the streets and placed on a wooden stage and told to dance it out. The physicians watched from the edges as if the treatment were working. Families watched from the street. The city was treating a catastrophe as a medical procedure, and the procedure was killing the patients. The cure made everything worse. The music drew more dancers. The stage gave the affliction a venue and an audience. People who had watched from doorways for days stepped forward and could not step back. The numbers climbed. Dancers collapsed on the platform the city had built. Some suffered strokes. Some suffered cardiac arrest. The city chronicler recorded the deaths in the same flat language used for market disputes and property transfers. No urgency in the documentation. No alarm. The musicians kept playing. The physicians adjusted nothing. Strasbourg was watching its citizens dance themselves to death and responding with a louder tempo. By late August, the streets near the Guildhall smelled of sweat and infection, and something worse. Open sores on the dancers' feet went untreated. The stage boards were dark with blood. Some dancers had worn through their shoes entirely and danced barefoot on wood splinters. What had begun as a medical curiosity had become something closer to a public execution carried out by the victims' own bodies. In September, the council reversed course. The stage came down. The remaining dancers were carted to a mountaintop shrine at Hohenstein. Prayers were offered. Holy relics were pressed to their bodies. Red shoes were placed on their feet and sprinkled with holy water and oil. The plague broke slowly over the following weeks. No one recorded the day the last dancers stopped. John Waller of Michigan State University identified the event in 2008 as mass psychogenic illness, linking it to extreme distress from famine, smallpox, and syphilis in the preceding years. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Mass psychogenic illness produces fainting, tremors, nausea, and paralysis. It does not produce coordinated rhythmic movement sustained over days. The dancing was not random. Witnesses described structured, repetitive motion consistent across hundreds of unrelated people. No modern model of conversion disorder accounts for sustained involuntary rhythm in that many subjects simultaneously. 400 people were seized by their own bodies in broad daylight in a functioning European city. The council tried medicine, then music, then God. None worked on command. The plague ended when it ended. The historical record confirms every detail and explains almost nothing. The body remembers what the mind refuses to carry. Sometimes the memory moves. Number 9. The Werewolf of Livonia. In 1692, in the Livonian town of Jürgensburg, an 80-year-old man named Thies appeared before a local ecclesiastical court. The matter was petty theft. Under routine questioning, he offered something that halted the proceedings entirely. He stated, calmly, without any distress, that he was a werewolf. The judges waited for the terror that always accompanied such admissions. It did not come. Thies was not confessing a crime. He was stating his profession. His account was detailed and delivered with the patience of a man who had explained this many times before. 3 times a year, on the nights of St. Lucia, Pentecost, and St. John, he and other werewolves descended into hell. They carried iron whips. They fought the devil's sorcerers in battles that determined the harvest. If the werewolves won, the grain would grow. If they lost, the sorcerers carried the season's fertility down to hell, and famine followed. Thies was not ashamed. He was proud. The scars on his face, he said, came from a sorcerer named Skaston, who had broken his nose with a broom handle wrapped in a horse's tail during one of the descents. He spoke of this the way a retired soldier speaks of a wound earned in a campaign he still considers just. The judges tried to redirect him toward the expected script. Confess that the devil gave this power. Repent. Accept the theology the court required. Thies refused. Repeatedly. Without anger. He corrected the judges when they mischaracterized his account. The wolf shape was not a curse. It was a calling. He served God. The werewolves were soldiers of heaven. The devil was the enemy, not the master. The judges had processed hundreds of accused witches who wept and eventually broke under pressure. They had never sat across from a man who claimed to be a monster and meant it as a point of pride. The court was paralyzed. Every mechanism of early modern persecution depended on a shared script. The accused feared damnation. The demon was evil. Confession ended in repentance. Thies was reading from a book the court had never seen. He smiled during his testimony. He offered details no one had asked for. He described the layout of hell as if he had traveled there regularly, which he claimed he had. He told the court that German werewolves had their own territory, and that their Livonian counterparts sometimes quarreled with them over boundaries. He provided this detail as casually as a farmer describing a fence dispute. He was patient with the judges, like a veteran explaining something obvious to men who had never been near a battlefield. They sentenced him to 10 lashes for superstition. Not heresy, not witchcraft, not consorting with the devil. The lightest charge available. Carlo Ginzburg of the University of Bologna demonstrated in 1966 that Thies was not alone. Scattered across Livonian, Baltic, and Slavic court records are nearly identical testimonies. The harvest battle, the descent into a spirit world, the defense of the community. These were fragments of a coherent pre-Christian belief system the witch trial apparatus had never been designed to encounter. But here is where the conventional reading collapses into something stranger. The courts had spent decades burning people for consorting with the devil. They had never imagined a defendant who agreed about the reality of the supernatural, but disagreed about everything else. The wolf was a guardian. The transformation was sacred. The 10 lashes were not a punishment. They were a confession from the institution itself. The system had met something it could not categorize, and the only available response was to pretend the encounter was minor. The machine did not break. It simply looked away. Number 8. The Great Fear. Between July 20th and August 6th, 1789. 17 days. That is how long it took for a rumor with no verified origin to weaponize the entire French countryside. No brigand army existed. No coordinated attack had been planned. The panic was simultaneous across regions that shared no communication infrastructure. An entire nation armed itself against an enemy that was not there. The Bastille had fallen on July 14th. Rural France heard distorted, third-hand fragments of the urban upheaval. Couriers carried partial news that mutated at every relay. Village priests interpreted events from pulpits based on rumors of rumors. Then a new rumor landed in dozens of places at once. Brigands, hired by the aristocracy, were coming to burn the crops and starve the peasantry into submission. The punishment for revolution would be famine. The rumor had no identifiable author. No pamphlet carried it. It materialized in villages that had no contact with one another in the same week. Villages mobilized within hours. Church bells rang the tocsin, the rapid alarm pattern that meant immediate danger. Men gathered with pitchforks, scythes, and hunting muskets. Women hid children in cellars and root stores. Livestock was driven into barns and the doors barred. Roads were blocked with overturned carts and felled trees. Watchers climbed to steeples and hilltops, scanning for columns of dust that would signal an approaching army. The watchers stared all day and all night. the dust never came. Neighboring villages saw the mobilization and took it as confirmation. If the next valley was arming, the brigands must be close. The panic fed itself across sightlines. Town after town prepared for a siege that would never arrive. Granaries were locked. Bridges were guarded with armed men. Strangers caught on the road were seized and interrogated. Several were beaten to death on suspicion of being advance scouts for the Phantom Army. The brigands never came. The fear did not dissipate. It pivoted. If the aristocracy had sent brigands, the aristocracy was the enemy. Armed peasants who had gathered to defend their fields turned on the nearest manor house instead. Feudal records were dragged from estate offices into courtyards and burned. Tax ledgers, debt registries, titles of feudal obligation reaching back centuries, all fed to the fire. Some lords fled, others were dragged from their homes. The documents that sustained the old social order turned to ash, because the people who lived under them panicked at a phantom, and then realized the phantom was beside the point. The real threat had always been the parchment in the manor office. By August, the National Assembly in Paris abolished feudal privileges. The entire legal architecture of French rural life was dismantled in a single session, triggered by a panic over an army that never marched. Georges Lefebvre of the University of Strasbourg documented in 1932 that the identical panics erupted simultaneously across at least 5 disconnected regions. No writer carried the rumor fast enough. No known communication network connected the affected villages. The timeline permits no single point of origin. But here is where the nightmare begins. This was not a chain reaction spreading outward from a center. It was simultaneous ignition. Disconnected populations with no shared information source produced the same rumor, the same mobilization, the same violence, within days. No evidence of contact between them. The fear appeared to generate itself. The countryside armed against an army that did not exist, and in doing so destroyed a social order that had governed it for centuries. No one planned this. No pamphlet proposed it. The Great Fear was a collective hallucination that produced permanent, irreversible consequences. The brigands never arrived. The world they were supposed to defend never came back. Number 7. The Tarantism epidemic. The fields outside Taranto in the 14th century were ordinary. Wheat, olives, relentless sun beating down on workers who harvested by hand and slept in the open during the worst of the heat. And then, in a pattern that would repeat across southern Italy for the next 300 years, someone would be bitten. A spider, a scorpion, sometimes nothing anyone could identify afterward. The bite was unremarkable. What followed it was not. The bitten person began to scream, to run through the streets without direction, to throw themselves into fountains, streams, and wells. The affliction was called tarantism. The blame fell on the wolf spider common to the region. But the local species carried venom too mild to produce anything close to what witnesses described. The prescribed cure was music. A rapid, repetitive rhythm played on tambourines and fiddles, sometimes continuously for days. The afflicted danced. Not gently. They thrashed in public squares for hours, soaked in sweat, eyes rolled back, while the entire town stopped its work to watch, and the musicians played without pause. The music had to be exact. Certain melodies produced immediate calm, others triggered violent convulsions. If the wrong tune was played, the sufferer collapsed screaming and clawed at the ground. If the right one started, they surged upright with desperate energy. Musicians learned by trial, cycling through modes and tempos until they found the combination for each individual case. No two sufferers responded to the same sequence. The specificity was total. No known venom produces selective sensitivity to musical intervals. Women were disproportionately affected. Some accounts suggest ratios as high as 9-1. In the deeply patriarchal villages of Puglia and Salento, tarantism became the single context in which a woman could scream in public, could weep openly, could thrash on the ground and be held and demand that the entire village attend to her pain. Married women trapped in violent households. Widows carrying grief the community expected them to bear in silence. The bite arrived, and suddenly a body expected to cook, carry, and be silent was permitted to move, permitted to take up space. No husband could intervene during the ritual. No priest could overrule the musicians. The cure belonged to the body, not the institution. The bite was permission. The dance was the only language available. The phenomenon repeated every summer for 3 centuries. Musicians specialized in the tarantella and were paid professional rates. Churches tolerated the rituals. Families budgeted for the annual cost the way they budgeted for harvest labor. Tarantism was not a crisis. It was an institution that structured village life across generations. Ernesto de Martino of the University of Cagliari documented surviving rituals in Salento in 1961. He argued the phenomenon functioned as religiously sanctioned catharsis for forbidden grief, rage, and desire, experienced overwhelmingly by women. But de Martino's own data contained something his framework could not hold. The afflicted described physiological sensations with remarkable consistency across centuries of recorded testimony. Specific colors triggered convulsions. Green was reported as intolerable in accounts separated by 200 years. Specific musical intervals calmed, while nearly identical intervals a half step away produced violence. If tarantism was purely psychogenic, the responses should have varied wildly between individuals and eras. They did not. Too consistent to be invented. Too strange to be organic. For 300 years, the fields outside Taranto produced a condition that medicine could not diagnose, religion could not exorcise, and music could treat but never explain. The women who danced were not sick in any way a physician could verify. Tarantism did not end because it was cured. It ended because the society that needed it changed. The bite was never the cause. It was the excuse. The dancing was never the cure. It was the only language the body had when every other language had been taken away. Number 6. The Nuns of LOUDUN. In 1634, in the Ursuline convent of LOUDUN, a small town in western France, the Mother Superior Jeanne des Anges sent an urgent report to church authorities. She and 17 of her sisters had been visited in the night by a demon. The demon, she said, had been sent by a specific man. She named him Father Urbain Grandier, the town's parish priest, a man whose enemies reached all the way to Cardinal Richelieu. The accusation landed at a very convenient moment for very powerful people. The nuns began convulsing during Mass. They screamed obscenities in voices witnesses described as inhuman. They bent backward until their heads touched their heels. They clawed at their habits until the fabric tore. They named specific demons: Asmodai, Issacharion, Behemoth, Leviathan. Each nun claimed a demon inhabited her body, and each named Grandier as the sender. The convent was no longer a place of prayer. It was a theater of horror whose audience grew weekly. Public exorcisms were staged in churches large enough for the crowds. Jeanne des Anges writhed on stone floors before hundreds of spectators. She contorted into positions physicians said should have caused injury. She accused Grandier with a precision that matched the exorcist's own published manuals suspiciously well. Spectators traveled from across France to watch. The exorcisms were choreographed, prolonged, and emotionally devastating for everyone present. Grandier was handsome, outspoken, and catastrophically careless with his enemies. He had published against clerical celibacy. He had conducted at least one public affair. He had mocked powerful men in a town small enough that every word traveled. Richelieu had his own reasons for wanting him gone. When the nuns pointed, the political machinery activated without hesitation. Grandier was arrested. A document was produced in court, allegedly a pact with Satan, signed in blood by named demons. His legs were crushed in the brodequins during interrogation. Bones splintered. Marrow was reportedly visible. He refused to confess. He maintained his innocence through every stage of a process designed to make innocence impossible. In August of 1634, he was burned alive in the public square. The executioner struck him across the face with an iron crucifix to prevent him from speaking to the crowd. The nuns continued convulsing after his death. Michel de Certeau of the University of Paris documented in 1970 that the exorcists had been handpicked by Richelieu's allies. The questioning followed scripts designed to produce accusations that fit a pre-written legal narrative. The possession was, at least in its origins, a political assassination conducted through theological theater. But here is where the political reading collapses. Several nuns continued convulsing for years after Grandier died, long past any political utility. Jeanne des Anges developed stigmata on her left hand, marks she displayed publicly for the rest of her life. She toured France for decades as a celebrity mystic. She was received at the royal court. If the possession was manufactured, it should have stopped when the target died. It did not. Something had been activated that outlived the conspiracy. The most unsettling thing about LOUDUN is not that the possession was faked. It is the possibility that it began as performance and became real. That somewhere between the first scripted accusation and the decades of convulsions that followed, a line was crossed that no one in the room could see. The fire that killed Grandier was real. The conspiracy was real. But whatever continued burning in that convent after he was dead was something none of the conspirators had planned for, and none of them could stop. Number 5. The Andover Touch Test. 40. That is the number of witchcraft accusations produced in Andover, Massachusetts, in the autumn of 1692. The town had barely 600 residents, not Salem, Andover, a neighboring community that imported Salem's diagnostic method, applied it with bureaucratic rigor, and produced an accusation rate per capita that exceeded Salem itself. The method was called the touch test. It was considered empirical. The procedure was straightforward. An afflicted girl, typically a teenager in convulsions, was brought before a suspect. The suspect was made to touch the girl on the hand or arm. If the convulsions stopped upon contact, the suspect was the witch. The underlying logic held that demonic energy returned to its source through physical touch. This was not folk magic. It was entered as legal evidence in formal court proceedings. Magistrates trained in English common law accepted the results alongside sworn depositions without distinction. Andover did not stumble into this. Town leaders actively invited Salem's afflicted girls to identify local witches. The teenagers traveled from Salem. The touch tests began in organized sessions. The girls convulsed on cue, were touched, stopped on cue. The results were consistent, reproducible, devastating. Each positive test generated a new accused. Each new accused generated a new test. The pipeline was self-feeding and self-accelerating. Accusations cascaded through families and then through entire neighborhoods. A mother was named, then her daughter, then the daughter's husband. The incentive structure was lethal in its precision. Confessing witches were spared execution. Denying witches were hanged. The system punished innocence and rewarded false admission. The mathematics were clear enough that even children understood. Neighbors accused neighbors they had feuded with for years over fence lines and water rights. Children stood in courtrooms and testified against their own parents. Wives against husbands. The social fabric of Andover was methodically disassembled, one touch test at a time, by people who believed they were following a procedure. Dudley Bradstreet, the justice of the peace, recognized what was happening. He refused to sign more arrest warrants. Within days, he was accused of witchcraft himself. His wife was accused. His family packed what they could carry and fled Andover in the night. The machine tolerated no hesitation from its operators. Anyone who questioned the method became the method's next subject. Richard Latner of Tulane University demonstrated in 2006 that the touch test produced a conviction pattern statistically identical to random targeting. Accusations mapped onto property disputes and family rivalries, not behavior. But Andover was not an echo of Salem. It was an escalation. Salem was chaotic, driven by personal grudges and adolescent performances. Andover systematized the process. The touch test gave the hysteria a method that looked empirical, that could be repeated, that delivered consistent results. Andover built a machine for producing witches, and the machine worked precisely as designed until it consumed its own operators. The apparatus collapsed only when the governor's wife was named. The social ceiling was breached and the system was recognized as absurd within weeks. Nothing about the method changed. Only who it pointed at. The touch test was not superstition. It was procedure. It had a hypothesis, a protocol, and a reproducible result. The people of Andover did not abandon reason. They applied it. They followed the method and imprisoned their neighbors with the calm certainty of people who believed they were being careful. The hysteria was not the absence of rationality. It was rationality in the service of a false premise, executed with the confidence of people who never questioned the foundation. That is not a medieval problem. That is a permanent one. Number 4. The drummer of NIKLASHAUSEN. NIKLASHAUSEN in 1476 was a village so small it barely appeared on episcopal maps. A few hundred souls, a stone church. fields in every direction ending at forests. The peasants were forbidden to enter, and rivers they were forbidden to fish. A shepherd named Hans Bohm tended his flock on the hillside above the village. He played a small drum to pass the hours. He was known to no one beyond the valley. Then in March he walked into the village square, set his drum on the ground, burned it in front of a gathering crowd, and announced that the Virgin Mary had spoken to him. She had a message for the world. Within weeks, 20,000 people were walking toward NIKLASHAUSEN to hear it. The message was specific and radical beyond anything the crowd expected. All taxes were abolished by divine decree. All fishing and hunting rights were returned to the common people. All tithes to the church were void. The forests and the rivers and the game within them belonged to everyone. The nobles and the bishops had stolen from the poor what God had given freely, and the Virgin demanded it returned. Every sentence addressed a grievance that every peasant in Franconia lived with daily. The forest visible from their doorstep but forbidden. The river running through the village but whose fish belonged to the Lord. The tithe collector arriving after every harvest to take grain their children needed. This was not vague prophecy. It was an economic program delivered through divine authority, and it struck the countryside like a match on dry straw. Pilgrims overwhelmed every road and field for miles. They came from Franconia, the Rhineland, Thuringia, and Bavaria. They walked for days through spring mud carrying offerings of money and wax. They sang hymns Bohm had composed. They slept in barns and ditches and open fields. 20,000 is the conservative estimate. The village had no infrastructure for any of it. The roads clogged, the fields were trampled flat. The church held perhaps 100. The rest listened from open ground as Bohm preached from a platform his followers built from scrap timber. The Bishop of Würzburg saw what was forming, not a pilgrimage. An army around a manifesto that directly threatened every revenue stream the church and aristocracy depended on. He sent soldiers at night. Bohm was seized from the village in darkness, before his followers woke. He was tried for heresy and burned at the stake. The entire sequence from arrest to ashes was measured in days. The pilgrims dispersed, not after resistance, not after mourning, not after debate or reorganization. Almost immediately, 20,000 people who had walked across entire regions to hear the voice of God turned around and went home the moment the voice was silenced. A handful attempted a march on Würzburg. They were scattered by a small detachment without fighting. The rest simply left. The roads emptied, the trampled fields began to recover. Klaus Arnold of the University of Würzburg documented in 1980 that within weeks, neighboring towns showed no evidence the mobilization had ever occurred. But the collapse is the anomaly, not the movement. Peasant uprisings in the 15th century did not end when leaders were killed. They radicalized. The Hussite Wars lasted decades after Jan Hus burned. The German Peasants' War of 1525 survived multiple leader executions. NIKLASHAUSEN did not radicalize. It evaporated. 20,000 people shed conviction in hours, as if the belief had never been theirs, as if it had been on loan from a single throat and was recalled the instant that throat stopped making sound. Hans Bohm was a shepherd who burned a drum and emptied a region. His message was not abstract. It was a detailed reordering of who owned what, delivered as divine command. 20,000 people believed enough to walk for days. Then he was taken, and they went home, and the forests and rivers remained exactly as they had been. The taxes resumed. The fish stayed forbidden. Whatever NIKLASHAUSEN was, it was not a movement, it was a sound. When the source was silenced, the sound stopped. The silence that followed is almost more disturbing than the noise. Number 3. The Convulsionnaires of SAINT-MÉDARD. In 1727, in the cemetery of SAINT-MÉDARD, on the outskirts of Paris, a Jansenist deacon named François de Paris was buried in an unmarked grave. He had spent his life in deliberate, extreme poverty. He slept on bare floors. He gave away his entire inheritance. He ate so little that friends feared for his life years before he died. He was no one of political consequence. Within days of his burial, pilgrims who knelt at his grave began to convulse. What they would eventually ask to have done to their bodies would take years to fully reveal. The convulsions started simply. Pilgrims fell at the graveside. They thrashed, screamed, wept with a violence that frightened the other mourners. Some reported miraculous healings. A woman blind for years claimed her vision returned. A man paralyzed from the waist stood and walked in front of dozens of witnesses. The Jansenist community, locked in a bitter theological war with the Jesuits and the French crown, seized on the miracles as divine proof that God favored their cause. The grave of an unremarkable deacon became the most contested ground in France. Word spread across the city. The curious came first, then the devout, then those who simply wanted to see something they had been told was impossible. A theological war was now being fought with bodies instead of arguments, and the audience was growing faster than any authority could manage. Then it escalated beyond anything anyone could control. Pilgrims began requesting what they called secours, aid. The aid consisted of being beaten with heavy logs, stomped on with boots, pressed beneath planks loaded with paving stones, punched repeatedly in the abdomen. The convulsionaires insisted the violence healed them. They reported no pain whatsoever. They displayed no bruising, no injuries consistent with the forces applied. Witnesses who delivered the blows described the deeply unsettling sensation of striking something that did not respond like human tissue. The flesh-absorbed impact that should have killed. Thousands attended daily. The cemetery became the most attended spectacle in Paris, outstripping the theater and the public executions. In 1732, the crown sealed the cemetery with iron gates and stationed royal guards. A famous graffito appeared on the wall overnight. By order of the king, God is forbidden to perform miracles in this place. Paris laughed. The Jansenists were furious. The convulsionaires were unmoved. The convulsions did not stop. They moved indoors. Private apartments across the city became clandestine convulsion chambers. The movement went underground and intensified. The secours escalated to extremes. Crucifixions were reported. Sword swallowing. Participants held over open flames for prolonged periods. They insisted they felt nothing. Catherine Mayer, of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, documented in 2002 that the clandestine cells persisted until at least the 1770s, more than 40 years after the cemetery was sealed, and the later participants had no connection to the original Jansenist theological dispute. But here is where the nightmare begins. The first impossibility is that sealing the cemetery did not end it. The convulsions relocated, intensified, and outlasted the crisis by decades. The second impossibility is deeper. The later participants were not Jansenists. The political war was over. The original cause had evaporated entirely, and the convulsions continued without it. The behavior had detached from its origin and become self-sustaining. The container broke and the contents kept moving. The crown believed the location was the cause. Remove the site, end the spectacle. But SAINT-MÉDARD was never the cause. It was the ignition point. Whatever began at that graveside did not need the grave, did not need Jansenism, did not need an audience. It needed only bodies willing to enter a state that no theology could explain and no authority could end. The body entered that state. The state did not require a reason to continue. It only required a reason to begin. Number 2. The Children's Crusade. 30,000. That is the number most frequently cited for the young people who left their homes in the summer of 1212. They walked south toward the Mediterranean. They believed God would part the waters and let them walk to Jerusalem. No army marched with them. No adult organized the departure. The sea did not part. Most of them never came home. Two movements rose independently that summer. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes appeared carrying what he claimed was a letter from Christ himself, addressed to the king. He announced that God had chosen the innocent to liberate the Holy Land where armed knights had failed. In Cologne, a boy named Nicholas made an almost identical claim with almost identical conviction. Both attracted thousands within weeks. Most followers were young. Many were children. The theology was devastating in its simplicity. God would recognize purity. Innocence would open the doors that violence could not. The children would walk to Jerusalem and the world would part before them because they had not yet sinned enough to deserve its resistance. The journey was brutal from the first day. The columns walked through July and August heat across hundreds of miles of open road. They had no supplies and no organized provisions. They begged for food at every settlement. Some communities fed them out of pity or religious awe. Others bolted their doors and sent riders to warn the next town. Chroniclers described the columns as enormous, ragged, and singing, surrounded by an atmosphere that alternated between ecstasy and funeral procession. Children collapsed from heat and hunger along roadsides and were left behind. No one carried them, no one turned back. The column moved as if it had a will separate from any individual inside it. Stephen's group reached Marseille after weeks of walking. The sea did not part. The column gathered at the harbor and prayed. Days passed. The water remained. Two merchants named Hugo Farias and William Porcus appeared and offered to transport them by ship, claiming it was an act of piety. 7 ships sailed from Marseille. 2 wrecked near Sardinia. All passengers drowned. The remaining 5 sailed not to Jerusalem, but to Bougie and Alexandria on the North African coast. The passengers were taken ashore and sold into slavery. The merchants had arranged the sale before the ships left port. Nicholas's German column attempted the Alpine passes. The mountains were not kind. Hundreds died of exposure and starvation during the crossings. The survivors straggled into Genoa and other Italian port cities, expecting ships to carry them east. No ships came. No miracles materialized. The group disintegrated. Some found work and settled. Some attempted the long walk home across mountains they had barely survived going the other direction. Most were never accounted for in any record. The chronicles simply stop mentioning them. The names vanish. Gary Dixon of the University of Edinburgh confirmed in 2008 that the mass departure, the failed crossing, and the enslavement are attested in multiple independent sources. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The first impossibility is the children themselves. 30,000 mobilized across 2 countries without any adult organizing structure. No institution recruited them, no king commanded them. They simply left home and walked south, singing. The second impossibility is worse. The adults let them go. Not a few parents in one village. Across hundreds of communities in France and Germany, parents watched their children walk toward a sea that was not going to open. The children believed God would intervene. The adults had no such guarantee and no such excuse. And the doors stayed open until the singing faded down the road. The Children's Crusade is not a story about faith. It is a story about what a society does when it has exhausted every option and turns to the only resource it has not yet spent. The armed crusades had failed. The diplomats had failed. The kings and the popes and the generals had failed. What remained was innocence, and a continent so desperate for a miracle that it sent its children toward the sea. The road south was long and the singing carried for miles. The parents stood in doorways and did not close them until the sound was gone. The sea did not part. The merchants were waiting, and the silence that followed was the sound of a civilization discovering it had nothing left to send. Number 1. The Flagellant Movement. The roads of Central Europe in 1349 were not empty. They were full. Full of the dying. Full of the fleeing. Full of families carrying everything they owned toward towns that had already shut their gates. The Black Death was killing between 30 and 60% of every community it reached. Physicians could not slow it. Priests could not explain it. Prayer produced nothing. And then on roads already choked with the desperate, a new column appeared. They walked in tight formation. They sang in unison, and they were covered head to waist in their own blood. The flagellants marched in disciplined processions of 200 to 300. They had written rules, internal hierarchies, and initiation ceremonies. New members swore obedience to a group master who determined the route, the schedule, and the ritual. Their circuits between towns lasted exactly 33.5 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life. They entered each new town in formation, chanting, with their leather whips held upright like standards. Their discipline was not the disorder of refugees. It was the precision of an army that answered to a different commander. Twice each day the procession stopped in a public square. The flagellants stripped to the waist, arranged themselves in a circle, and on the master's command began beating themselves with leather whips embedded with iron spikes. The spikes were sharpened to cut deep. Blood ran down their backs and pooled on the cobblestones in quantities that witnesses described as shocking. The beating was synchronized. At specific moments they fell to the ground in postures representing named sins: adultery, perjury, murder, blasphemy. Each sin had its position, its duration, its prescribed number of lashes. The ritual was not chaos. It was liturgy, performed in flesh and executed with the precision of a mass. The crowds were enormous and emotionally overwhelmed. Townspeople watched in silence, in tears, or in something closer to trance. The flagellant's blood was considered sacred. Spectators rushed forward with rags to soak in the blood pooling on the stones. Women pressed the cloths to their faces and to their sick children. Some onlookers joined the procession on the spot, stripping their shirts and taking up whips before anyone could counsel them otherwise. The emotional pressure of watching synchronized public self-mutilation, framed as the only remaining transaction God would accept, proved nearly impossible to resist in towns already hollowed by plague and grief. The theology was explicit, total, and internally seamless. God had sent the Black Death as punishment for human sin. The only acceptable response was not prayer, which had failed, not confession, which required priests who were themselves dying. The only response was direct, physical, public suffering, offered from the body of the sinner to the eyes of God without institutional intermediary. The flagellants believed each stroke purchased divine mercy. Their blood was currency in a cosmic transaction. The Church was horrified, not primarily by the gore but by the structural implication. If lay people could expiate sin through their own pain, the priesthood was unnecessary. The sacramental system was being bypassed entirely. The flagellants had built a parallel church with no roof, no altar, and no clergy. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in October of 1349. The flagellants ignored the condemnation completely. Their authority was not written in papal bulls. It was written on their backs. The flagellant processions drew followers the way fire draws oxygen. In some towns, the population doubled overnight when a procession arrived. Merchants sold food to the crowds. Innkeepers filled every room. The economy of grief was booming. Then the violence turned outward. In town after town across the Rhineland, the Low Countries, and Central Europe, the flagellant processions were followed within days by organized attacks on Jewish communities. The logic was seamless within the system and required no external incitement. If God sent the plague and the flagellant's blood had not stopped it, a deeper corruption must be at work. Someone was poisoning the wells. Someone was maintaining the divine anger. The movement that began as penance became organized massacre. The blood they shed was no longer only their own. Norman Cohn of the University of Sussex documented in 1970 that flagellant arrivals in a town were statistically correlated with subsequent anti-Jewish violence in that same town. The pattern was structural, predictable, and repeated across hundreds of communities. But here is where the nightmare reaches its deepest floor. The flagellants did not stop the plague. They spread it. Hundreds marching in close contact. Open wounds refreshed twice daily with spiked whips. Entering communities the disease had not yet reached, and leaving infection behind them. The ritual designed to end God's punishment became one of the most efficient vectors for the very disease it was supposed to cure. The flagellants carried the plague on their bodies, in the blood they shed to wash it away. The cure was the contagion. The penance was the vector. They believed suffering would save them, and the suffering spread the disease. They believed someone must be guilty, so they turned on the nearest scapegoat with the same absolute conviction they turned the whips on themselves. The logic never broke. Every failure was absorbed into the framework. If the blood does not stop the plague, bleed harder. If bleeding harder does not work, find the ones who are truly responsible. The movement did not collapse under the weight of its own contradiction because the participants could not see the contradiction. They were inside it. The search for someone to blame was the very thing that made it impossible to stop. That is not a medieval problem. That is the structure of every panic that has ever turned a frightened population into a dangerous one. The only difference is the instrument. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.